everyone, welcome to session 20, Factors Affecting Punishment. In the previous section, we had gone over some of the ways in which we define punishment. One way was, again, looking at an operational definition, which is what Skinner had proposed originally, and then following up with that, some more experimental analysis of behavior research, which indicated that perhaps it made sense to define punishment in terms of a functional definition, and we also had gone over learned helplessness as one of the kinds of conditions that might actually induce depression as a result of contact with punishing stimuli and our inability to actually regulate and operate on the environment to make things better for ourselves one way or the other. In this section, we will go over some more of the factors affecting punishment. And again, one of the things that becomes hopefully clear is that from many different perspectives, and primarily also from an experimental perspective, there are a lot of reasons why we should avoid ever having to use punishment. There are far more effective ways of managing behavior, thinking proactively, knowing how to use, through errorless discrimination training, positive reinforcement techniques, and so forth and so on. So, hopefully, over the course of the next couple of sessions, I'll convince you that this is absolutely true, that aversive control, if it is used, should be used really as a last alternative, and we know enough about using positive reinforcement and schedules and many other things to determine when positive reinforcers don't work immediately for us. There are many ways in which we can arrange the environment to enhance the effectiveness of positive reinforcement. This is something we're going to talk about in the next couple of sessions when we get to complex behavior. So hopefully convincing you that punishment's not the way to go. However, if you are going to use punishment and you find yourself in a position where you absolutely positively must use that, I want to bring to your attention some of the variables that we know about that will affect the outcome. That is, whether the punishment's going to be effective or not, and more importantly, if you have to use it in the most sparing way, and ways in which will it achieve the quickest outcome. So once you have that behavior under control, if you must do that, you could dispense with the aversive techniques and rely primarily on the positive reinforcement techniques. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and freeze my camera here. Excellent. And let's take a look at some of the variables that I was mentioning before. The first one is that how are we to introduce the punishing stimulus? Research clearly tells us that the best method to use is something that introduces the punishing event in a sudden and immediate manner. That is, you don't want to necessarily rely entirely on warning after warning after warning. Again, sometimes those warnings turn out to be ineffective if it is not followed up by an unconditioned punisher. And we find that a lot of times that the manner of introduction becomes a very critical variable. Let's take in consideration for a moment that you are a college student and you decide to buy yourself a puppy. And by the way, that's not always the best thing to do sometimes when we're college students, unless we have somebody who is able to coordinate scheduling when one person's at class, another person might come over to the house to let the dog out or whatever, unless you have newspaper all over the floor. In terms of teaching, though, oftentimes a college student may go and let their dog out right before before their classes start, maybe a 9 o'clock class. So maybe at about 8:30 they run out and let their dog out and hope that the puppy actually goes to the bathroom in the right place, the right time. It does everything they need to do so that you could go to your classes. But you find sometimes it takes a little bit longer. Puppies like to smell outside and do other things. And the first thing they do doesn't necessarily comprise letting go of their sphincters and bowels and bladders and so forth and so on at our convenience. So we bring the dog back inside. They may or may not have gone. We go to classes, and then somewhere at about maybe 10:30, your puppy wanders into the living room and leaves you a little gift on the carpeting, a nice little pile of poop. And that's at about, say, 10:30, and then you don't come back from your classes until about 12 o'clock. And when you come into the door, you see a puppy coming up and greeting you, little tail wagging, and then you see a little pile on the floor, and you deliver a punisher. And you might say, bad puppy. No, you don't do that over here. That's bad. You don't do that. And then you might pick the puppy up and maybe bring it over to another area and let it go to the bathroom, and maybe it will go to the bathroom, maybe not. Perhaps you might actually give a little, swat on the fanny while you're, saying no, bad puppy. And then the next day the same thing happens. Again, there is an event, an elimination that happens on your carpeting roughly at a time that's 10:30 or 10:15 or something like that. But again, the problem here is that you don't get home for at least about another half hour to 45 minutes, or maybe a little bit later. And when you come in and you see a pile on the floor and you deliver a punishing consequence upon your walking into the house, remember that you're not really punishing necessarily the behavior of pooping in the wrong place. What you're really punishing is the dog running up and greeting you. And that becomes a little bit more apparent because if you keep doing this for about a week, you find that when you come home, your puppy is no longer running up to greet you. Your puppy is actually standing at a distance, maybe kind of wagging its tail, pondering the question, did I do good or did I do bad? Maybe I should stay over here because apparently every time I run up and greet my master, they don't really like me greeting them. So, here we have the problem here of what exactly you are punishing. And the problem runs even further because rather than reading into the contingencies of punishment, we usually jump to all kinds of strange alternatives to describe the dog's behavior. After about 2 weeks of doing this, you've got your carpeting pretty much with alternating stains all over the place. And every time you come home, you see the puppy there, but the puppy doesn't greet you. The puppy is now freaking out, hiding under the couch. Why is that? Because every time you come home, you're a punishing stimulus. You are the deliverer of punishers. And rather than saying to yourself, number one, punishment's not working. Number two, the time between the pooping and the punishing stimulus is too remote. Instead, we look and see the accompanying behavior of the puppy hiding under the couch, and we say to ourselves, you see, he knows he did wrong. That's why he's hiding under the couch. And in fact, a behavior analyst quickly would point out, saying, no, that's not true at all. So, again, this is one of the reasons why we have to be very careful. If you don't catch the puppy actually engaging in the pooping behavior, and you come home and you see something on the floor, you might as well just let it go. You need to catch the dog actually engaging in the behavior. It's much more effective that way. And then you could actually go ahead and deliver the punishing stimulus. And by the way, taking the dog and smashing its nose into the poop does not make the stimulus, the temporal delay there, go away. So that's not necessarily an effective procedure either. You must catch the dog in the act. And there are very good ways to housebreak dogs. You could do it very quickly. A lot of that involves actually, again, reinforcing the alternative behavior. You arrange for a lot of frequent opportunities for the dog to go outside or go to a particular area and provide positive reinforcement for doing so, you'll probably find before too much longer that the puppy does pretty well. By the way, crating your dog is a very good idea at the very beginning. That is, when you're away, it makes sense to put the dog in a crate to minimize how far the dog will wander. It turns out many dogs don't necessarily poop in their own crates. And eventually you could, teach the dog and minimize the stains and reinforce the dog. Because as soon as the dog doesn't poop in the crate, you could let the dog out and immediately outside, have them go outside, they're going to poop almost immediately. And as soon as they do, you give them a little bit of a biscuit or maybe what we used to use, grated cheese. Little bits of cheddar cheese in small amounts really serve as powerful reinforcers. I really recommend that because you get more bang for your buck than actually using, Milk-Bone or some of these other things. Small little quantities of reinforcement, especially cheese, dogs love it. Okay? All right, let's move on. I could say so much about this stuff here, but we need to move on. Secondly, the intensity of the punisher also becomes extremely important. We've learned that if you start off with a punishing stimulus of mild intensity, and each time the behavior occurs you deliver a punishing stimulus, but over a period of time you just increase little by little over time the intensity of the punishing stimulus, you reach a point where you might develop something which is best perhaps described as habituation, which is really not necessarily in the Pavlovian sense, the strict sense, but the idea here is that a stimulus of mild intensity can not necessarily punish a behavior, and then certainly increasing the intensity a little bit at a time does not necessarily punish the behavior. Get right in there and go right to that intensity right from the start, that more intense stimulus, you might actually do much better in terms of suppressing the behavior. Now, there was a famous study that was done a while back in which they compared two groups of children and using a timeout as a procedure. Again, the timeout is not a contingent delivery of an aversive event. Timeout is the removal from positive reinforcement, in which that would be the type 2 kind of punishment that Skinner was talking about, removal from the classroom or something like that. And again, sometimes removal from a classroom does not necessarily constitute a punishing stimulus. I believe in this case it was probably a timeout from positive reinforcement in the sense of recess during school hours. And they compared one group that it was based on socially inappropriate behavior in the classroom, and group 1 actually started off and stayed with a timeout of 15 minutes. Group 2 had a timeout that started off at 5 minutes. Then after a period of time, they increased it to 10 minutes, then finally to 15 minutes, in which case the timeouts between group 1 and 2 are identical. And it turns out the group that actually had timeout 15 minutes right from the very beginning showed far more suppressed behavior using that procedure than the other ones who had the gradual increase in the timeout duration. Okay? So again, progressive punishers, at one level it looks like it's a more fair and humane thing to do. On the other hand, if it doesn't work in the long run and you have to sustain using a longer and longer punisher because of the way you introduced it, you have to ask the question, would it have been better just to start at the very beginning with a more intense one because you probably would have achieved your outcome and been able to dispense with it entirely, or do you kind of prolong that by gradually increasing this? I like to use the example of the National Lampoon Animal House, the notion that probation didn't work for Delta House, so they went to double secret probation, which nobody really knew about, and in that particular case did not actually even work. So again, we have to also take a look and consider what is the behavior to be punished. I've worked with parents and teachers sometimes, and it's amazing how little things of little verbal outbursts could really get people going so much that they want to inflict all kinds of strict punitive measures, when in fact it really wasn't that big of a deal. We have to really kind of put the behavior into perspective, and this is something I'm going to talk about in the next section. We've talked about alternatives to punishment. And again, you have to weigh into the balance what is the behavior that needs suppressed and what are the conditions under which it occurs. Is the behavior, for example, very dangerous? If you've got children who really don't know any better, who are out there, playing on railroad tracks, putting pennies on the railroad track and running away and letting a train or a commuter train run over it so it could flatten the penny out. That could be a very dangerous behavior. A child who is playing out in the middle of the street, that could be a dangerous behavior, whether it's ball playing or something like that. Children who are swimming in the ocean where there's a strong undercurrent or an undertow could be pretty dangerous. These are the things that one might want to consider in terms of using a punishing stimulus, because these things present a real danger. But, other things that are milder do not require intense punishers. If you have a child who's, mimicking you and making fun of you or something like that, you might not need to use something like that. It could be simple redirection. If you have a child who's in the bathtub, who's playing in the tub and splashing water all over the bathroom floor, maybe a simple redirection. Please, could you be a little bit more careful? You don't have to, throw the clock radio into the bathtub with a child to prove your point. All right, let's move on. Okay, the schedule of punishment. Under ideal circumstances, we find that FR1 punishment is the best way. That is, for every time the behavior to be punished occurs, you deliver a contingent FR1 punisher. Again, under best circumstances, it happens every time using the most intense punishing stimulus, and it's an instant, sudden, immediate introduction of the punishing stimulus. Now, again, these are under ideal circumstances, but we know in the real world, it's extremely difficult to impose FR1 punishment under behaviors, particularly those in which the punishing stimulus has to be mediated by other people. Now, in some instances, there may be FR1 punishment in the natural world, just the way the contingencies are arranged. Given that the circuitry and the electricity in my home works, every time I stick a metal object in a wall socket, I'm going to receive a shock. That would be considered FR1. But we cannot really sustain punishment socially under these conditions. Even under the most controlled conditions, it's very difficult to pull this off. Again, this is one of the things to consider here of, practically speaking, that being the case, if you get punished only once, but you get away with it 99 times, it doesn't. You could do the math yourself. It becomes actually advantageous to engage in the behavior that might get punished if you could get away with it enough. When you have punishment on FR1 where every time you get punished and you never receive the positive reinforcer, or the positive reinforcer is there but you're going to get nailed every single time you do it, this would probably have a bigger impact. But again, because practically speaking we can't pull this off, a lot of times when punishment's used in our culture, we already have the much working against us because the schedule of punishment is difficult to sustain. Fourth, and this is a very important one because I'm going to show you lots of data that was collected by Azrin and Holtz and many others in the 50s and 60s, which show you very clearly that if you punish a response and you're looking for the rate at which that behavior, that punished behavior goes down, if you provide alternative responses to gain access to the same reinforcer, that is, you have a behavior that's being reinforced and now you punish it. If you give an alternative response to get that same reinforcer, then the punished response will decrease much quicker. Okay? Let's take a look at some examples. Here you're looking at cumulative responses, and in terms here, this is number of minutes, and you've got here the rate of responding in a situation in which there's no punishment. Okay? Over here, you have a situation in which punishment is happening and there is no alternative response available. So here the person is responding to get the reinforcer, but the response is being punished. You see the change in the rate of responding based on the slope of the line. But now when you provide an alternative to the operant response, in other words, you engage in another operant response that's available to get the same reinforcer, look how quickly the rate of responding goes down. It's almost instantaneous. Okay? Instantaneous. You give that alternative, they will make a beeline to the alternative very, very rapidly, okay, and start engaging that behavior, and then the punished behavior just simply drops to zero. Okay? Let's show you another one. Here we are looking at the effect of the alternative response, okay, as a function of increasing the punishment intensity in terms of voltage. And you see here that the rate of responding when no alternative response is available, as you increase the intensity of the punishing stimulus over time, you start seeing this decline until finally it reaches zero. But if you provide an alternative, it doesn't mean that they will necessarily take the alternative, but once the intensity of the stimulus reaches some particular point, and here we're looking at maybe about 40 to 45 milliamps, when there's an alternative available, they make the switch over, go to the alternative response, and you see the rapid decline in the punished response. Okay? In the absence of this alternative, you would have had to have gone well past 50 to achieve zero. You would have had to have brought the punishing stimulus out to 80 in order to achieve the same outcome. Okay? So here again, you see, by providing an alternative behavior to obtain the same reinforcer, you are able to actually drive down the punished behavior. One of the things I'll point out now, and again I'll point out later, is that when we look sometimes at behavior to be punished, it's oftentimes not the reinforcer that the person is getting that's the problem. It's the operant response that they're engaging in to get the reinforcer. Okay? It's not a problem that a child necessarily desires cookies, is reinforced by Oreo cookies like I used to be. That's okay, and that's not a problem. The problem is the operant to get the reinforcer. If I go climbing over a hot stove, that's a problem. It's not a problem with the reinforcer. So by teaching a child to another alternative response to get the same cookie, I might actually decrease the frequency of climbing over a stove, particularly if, and again, a lot of times we present to children, a lot of no statements. Don't do this, don't do that. And they go ahead and do it, we punish. We don't always offer teaching alternatives and say, don't do it this way, do it that way. And we're going to talk about that shortly. Here's another example. Again, we're looking at punishment in terms of the increased intensity in terms of volts, and we're looking at punish responding. And here we're looking at the opportunity to make an escape response. Okay? And we see here that when there's no escape possible, behavior will eventually go down. But again, we could actually put in an escape response, make escape responsible, and get a quicker decrease in the punish responding, the frequency of that punish responding. Here we're looking at a situation in which, again, punishment intensity in terms of volts, the number of sessions, and you can see here as punishment intensity increases, you see responding in the punished situation goes down, and there's a switch over now to going into unpunished situations. Okay? All right, let's see here. Here's another variable to consider. It's called no unauthorized escape. In a situation in which we may actually use type 2 punishment, as Skinner described, that is removal from positive reinforcement, we might actually bring a person from a high reinforcement situation to a lower reinforcement situation. Certainly, by the way, we do this a lot of times when we send children perhaps to their room, when we have a child sit in the corner. Okay, we are presumably removing the child from a high reinforcement situation to a low reinforcement situation. We might have them sit out. Okay, go ahead and sit out from recess. Go sit down over there for 15 minutes and wait, and then you can come in and join the rest of the group again. So this is actually a very common sort of thing. But we have to assume that we are truly removing a person from a highly reinforcing situation to a lower reinforcement situation. If we're doing that, then presumably we are following the rules of type 2 punishment. And in fact, what we would expect to see, if this is truly a functional punisher, as Azra is saying, is that when we introduce this procedure to a child, right, we should see a decrease in the future probability of that behavior. And if we don't, we have to really question, is this really a punisher? That is, are we really removing the person from a reinforcing situation to a punishing situation, or are we mistaken, and in fact the situation they're in is actually not very reinforcing, and we are removing them to a more reinforcing situation? Now, this certainly does happen, in which a child might, such as Dr. Kupfer, who was who was a very picky eater as a child, and I would have to sit at the table. And, if I didn't eat my mother's meatloaf or Brussels sprouts or whatever she was cooking that I didn't like, I'd have to sit at the table. Not much reinforcement going on there. And, and she was also very careful to watch that I didn't just, feed the dog the food. But no such luck, because, even if I tried to feed broccoli to my dog wouldn't eat the broccoli, and then the broccoli would be on the floor and I'd get more trouble. So, to make a long story short, my mother would say, okay, you're done sitting at the table, you need to go to your room. Now, I would go over to my room where I, remember that I would, carefully plant snow cap, a box of little snow caps, and maybe a box of Skittles or something like that. I think at the time I was really into peanut butter crackers, so I would always, keep a couple of those stashed in the drawer in my room and something like that. So again, my being sent to the room is not necessarily a punishing stimulus. It's much more punishing to be sitting in front of a table of, smelly, meatloaf and broccoli and Brussels sprouts than it is to be hanging out in my room, eating peanut butter crackers and listening to, Sgt. Pepper. So, given the circumstances, that's what I'm talking about. In other words, no unauthorized escape means is that you got to make sure there's no negative reinforcement involved here. Now, I have here something called breakfast in bed, because this is a famous study that sort of illustrates this. It's usually in many textbooks that we see, in which a study was done in which they were examining the behavior. What they were looking at was conditioned suppression behavior. That is, they would start off by reinforcing a rat or a group of rats to respond on a lever of variable interval reinforcement. So again, on a variable interval schedule, it sustains a nice constant rate of responding. And based upon that, once you get that rate of responding going, you would go ahead and start introducing a punishing stimulus, starting off with perhaps a buzzer briefly, okay, like the conditioned suppression experiment, a buzzer or a clicker that's shortly followed by electric shock. And when you do that, as you recall from the previous session, you could actually get what's called conditioned suppression. You get a decrease in the rate of responding as long as that conditioned suppression stimulus is on. And what they would do in some of these studies was to create this condition of conditioned suppression in rats, and then introduce a drug such as, Valium, an anti-anxiety drug. And then to see that what does Valium do to an animal who's got the conditioned suppression? Presumably conditioned suppression, from a distance looks a little bit like an anxiety disorder. There's something in the environment, something that's coming up, it disrupts behavior, and the animal actually has perhaps some physiological reactions to it. Amongst the things that they do less is lever pressing. So if you give Valium, does their lever pressing come back? In other words, if it comes back to the way it was before, is that possibly evidence of an anti-anxiety medication that reduces that and gets rid of conditioned suppression effects? Well, this is what the model was. And they had created the conditioned suppression effect in virtually all the rats except one. And somewhere in the middle of one of the sessions, rather than seeing the conditioned suppression effect, they actually saw out of the clear blue a burst of responding, high rate responding that looked just like it did on variable interval, even though there was a conditioned suppression component involved. And they couldn't understand it until they had actually gone in to see and look in the chamber to see what the rat was doing. And remember now, the electricity is running into the grid floor, and the rat is pressing the lever, and the rat gets shocked through the feet. Well, what the rat had learned to do was actually roll over on his back and press the lever with its hind leg and hold its mouth underneath the food receptacle. So essentially you've got a rat who learned to completely avoid electric shock because when they're lying on their back, they're insulated by their fur. Now, of course, you may not believe this, but I suppose a picture is worth 1,000 words. And here you clearly see this rat has learned to escape and avoid the contingency of conditioned suppression via the situation. And that's why they call it breakfast in bed. And we got to be careful that we are not doing this, that we are not creating situations which are aversive and then sending individuals off to less aversive situations, assuming that that would be a punishing stimulus. All right. And then finally, we consider two more factors. Again, behavior and punishment does not happen in a vacuum. We have to really understand what is going on in terms of reinforcement for the behavior that is to be punished. This is, again, the point that Skinner was really getting at. If we focus too much on a punishing stimulus, we're missing the big picture. What is maintaining the behavior in the first place? Because if we understand more about that, we're in a much better position to do something about changing the behavior. So we have to look at things such as the effect of ongoing reinforcement frequency. And we learned through our research that when you reduce the frequency of reinforcement you gain from a particular response, right? So you're engaging in some behavior, you have some level of reinforcement for it, and your parents want to punish that behavior. However, that behavior is very reinforcing to you, so you continue doing that behavior even though your parents are punishing you again and again and again. Well, the thing here is that if the thing that you're doing becomes less and less reinforcing over time, then all of a sudden those punishing stimulus that you get from your parents start to mean something a little bit more. Okay, so what you got to think about here is that if you're going to punish a behavior, you note here that getting rid of behavior is going to be easier to do if the rate of responding is lower, and that just makes sense. Okay, that is, behavior that's maintained by a high frequency of reinforcement is very difficult to get rid of through punishment. So behaviors that are maintained by high frequency, such as alcohol and drug abuse, really are not necessarily susceptible to punishment. On the other hand, behaviors that are low frequency in behavior are much more susceptible to punishing. So again, cigarette smoking for somebody who's been smoking for a really long time might not be susceptible to punishment. But a child who only started smoking cigarettes, taking mommy or daddy's cigarettes, going outside, a quick little puff there, and they get caught and punished, there really wasn't that much reinforcement to begin with. In fact, probably the child did a lot of coughing, and it takes a little time for a child to actually learn to, get any of the reinforcing effects of a cigarette, whether it's physiological, because again, there's not a whole lot of nicotine getting into a child's body when they're just simply puffing and not inhaling. Okay, so again, this is something to consider here. That before you start going in there and punish, step back, look at the reinforcing behavior, and check out the reinforcement frequency. You may be able to actually alter the behavior by just altering the conditions or the contingencies of reinforcement that are ongoing. And then finally, we have to look at motivational variables. And that we note here that the more deprived you are of a reinforcer, the more behavior you're going to see directed towards getting the reinforcement, which means is that the punished behavior is going to go up and up and up if you keep the reinforcer deprivation in place. And therefore, what you see here is the inverse relationship between reinforcer deprivation and the effectiveness of punishment. As punishment deprivation increases, our reinforcement deprivation increases, the effectiveness of punishment decreases. As you decrease reinforcer deprivation, again, more reinforcer satiation, now the effectiveness of punishment actually might change for the better. Okay, these are, again, variables that we have seen in the experimental analysis of behavior. All right, at this point I'm going to stop, and I am going to